Tony Robbins' childhood did not begin with motivation, power, or fame. It began in chaos, instability, and emotional survival. Born into a family where love often felt conditional and safety was unpredictable, Tony learned at a very early age that life could be both harsh and confusing. His home environment was shaped by constant moves, financial uncertainty, and emotional tension that made it impossible for a child to simply feel secure. At times, the adults he depended on were overwhelmed by their own struggles, and the emotional temperature of the household could shift without warning. One moment there might be calm, the next moment could explode into conflict. As he later shared in conversations with Randall Kaplan, there were many nights when he lay awake not thinking about dreams or the future, but simply hoping that tomorrow would somehow be calmer than today. What shaped him deeply during these years was not just the lack of stability, but the feeling of being unseen and unheard. He didn't feel like a child with endless potential. He felt like a burden, like another problem in a world filled with problems. Yet even in those early moments of fear and confusion, something quietly formed inside him. A sensitivity to pain, a heightened awareness of emotion, and an instinct to observe human behavior. He began to study people without even realizing he was doing it, watching what made adults explode, what made them soften, what made them withdraw. While other children learned through security, Tony learned through survival. Each emotional wound, each moment of uncertainty, subtly trained his brain to search for meaning, control, and eventually, transformation. As he grew older, the weight of responsibility fell on him far too early. Instead of being guided and protected, he often became the emotional buffer between conflict and collapse. There were times when he felt like the adult in the room while still being just a child. He learned to manage tension, to sense danger in tone and body language, and to adapt his behavior depending on who he was dealing with. This constant emotional calculation was exhausting, but it also developed skills that later became the foundation of his life's work. During this period, poverty also tightened its grip on the family. There were days when food was uncertain, when electricity could disappear, and when humiliation settled quietly into his daily routine. What hurts most for a child is not always hunger, it is comparison. Watching others live with comfort while you live with scarcity creates a silent belief that you are somehow less than others. Tony carried that belief for years. He internalized the idea that success belonged to other people, not to him. Yet paradoxically, this same suffering created a hunger inside him, not just for food or money, but for meaning. He didn't want to simply escape poverty. He wanted to understand why some people rise while others remain trapped. These questions became the seeds of his obsession with human psychology, motivation, and behavior. He didn't know it yet, but the environment meant to break him was beginning to shape a future teacher of millions. One of the most defining shifts in Tony Robbins' childhood came during his teenage years, when anger and confusion began to boil over into rebellion. Carrying emotional pain without an outlet often turns inward or bursts outward, and in Tony's case, it did both. He struggled in school not because he lacked intelligence, but because his emotional world was too loud for quiet classrooms. Teachers saw a problem student. Few saw a wounded boy trying to survive emotional chaos at home. He describes moments of intense frustration where it felt like life itself was stacked against him. There were days when he questioned his worth, his purpose, and whether he would ever escape the gravity of his upbringing. During this period, he encountered mentors indirectly, through books, recordings, and ideas that challenged everything he believed about his limitations. For the first time, he was exposed to the radical idea that thoughts could shape emotions, and emotions could shape destiny. This discovery didn't change his life overnight, but it cracked open a door. He began to experiment with his mindset, testing whether changing internal language could change external reality. Each small victory, no matter how minor, planted evidence that transformation was possible. And in a household where hopelessness often felt dominant, possibility itself became revolutionary. One of the most emotional turning points Tony later shared with Randall Kaplan involved a moment of unexpected kindness that permanently rewired his understanding of humanity. During a holiday season when his family had nothing, no money, no food, no celebration waiting, someone knocked at their door and delivered groceries, gifts, and hope without asking for anything in return. That moment was not just about receiving food, it was about receiving belief. For the first time, Tony witnessed generosity not as a transaction, but as a pure act of compassion. That single experience shattered his assumption that the world was only cruel and indifferent. It planted inside him a lifelong commitment to service and giving. He later admitted that this moment became the spiritual foundation of his future philanthropy. It taught him that no matter how broken a situation seems, one act of love can disrupt an entire destiny. From that day forward, Tony made a silent promise to himself that if he ever had the power to help others, he would do it relentlessly. What he didn't realize at the time was that this promise would eventually lead him to feed millions and transform countless lives through his work. Leaving home did not instantly heal Tony Robbins, it only changed the battlefield. As a young man on his own, he still carried the emotional scars of his childhood: self-doubt, fear of abandonment, and an intense pressure to prove his worth. He chased success not only as a goal, but as a shield against the pain of his past. Early jobs were humbling, sometimes humiliating, but each failure taught him something vital about persistence. He became obsessed with understanding why some people quit and others persist, why some collapse under pressure and others rise. He studied mentors relentlessly, modeling their speech patterns, habits, and belief systems like a scientist studying human excellence. Underneath the ambition was still a wounded child searching for validation, but now that need for approval was being redirected into mastery. Slowly, his voice began to change, his posture began to shift, and his confidence transformed from forced courage into authentic certainty. He was no longer running from his past, he was running toward something greater. As Tony's influence began to grow, the unresolved pain of his childhood did not disappear, it transformed into empathy. Where others saw audiences, he saw wounded individuals searching for answers just like he once had. His childhood had taught him the sound of desperation, the silence of shame, and the confusion of hopelessness. This emotional literacy became his greatest strength. He could step onto a stage and feel exactly what his audience felt before they even spoke. His ability to connect at such a deep level was not taught in marketing books. It was earned in the invisible battlefield of childhood survival. With each breakthrough he facilitated, he was symbolically healing parts of his own past. Every person who stood up and reclaimed their power mirrored the transformation he had once fought for alone. In his conversations with Randall Kaplan, Tony often reflects not with bitterness but with gratitude. Gratitude not for the pain itself, but for the strength it forged. He acknowledges that without the instability, the hunger, the emotional conflict, and the loneliness, he may never have developed the intensity that now defines him. He does not glorify suffering, but he refuses to let it define him either. His story becomes a living contradiction, that broken beginnings do not produce broken endings, unless you let them. Through decades of work, he has proven that meaning is not found by avoiding pain, but by transforming it. His childhood, once a source of shame, became the very engine of his global impact. Tony Robbins' Untold childhood story is not simply a tale of hardship. It is a blueprint of human potential. It reveals how trauma, when confronted with courage and vision, can become fuel instead of a prison. His life stands as proof that your past does not dictate your future unless you give it that power. From the chaos of his early years to the global stages he now commands, the thread connecting it all is not luck, privilege, or perfection. It is relentless emotional resilience. His story reminds us that even if you begin life feeling invisible, unwanted, or powerless, the moment you decide to take ownership of your mind, your pain, and your destiny, everything changes. And sometimes, the very wounds you are ashamed of today become the reason millions listen to you tomorrow.